And welcome to the latest episode of Here's What We Know, the podcast of unexpected conversations. Before I get started, I want to thank my sponsors and encourage you to explore their businesses because without them, this isn't happening. Now, today's guest is someone we can all use some advice and wisdom from. She's packed a lot into her so far modest time on this planet. She's the founder of Paperpunk. We'll get into that here in a minute. Also, is an adjunct professor at the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design. It has a shorter name, but I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I'm going to get that info from her in just a second. And she's also written this book right here, along with the other. You see it behind her. Make Possibilities Happen. Start Now. It is Grace Hawthorne. Grace, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
I'm excited because, you're one of those people who it's not just theory for you. I mean, you put it into practicality. And the truth of it is, and that in a lot of higher education, and this is not a knock on higher education, you know it as well as anybody, a lot of it is theory. It's not somebody who's actually done this. As you said, there's knowledge and then there's wisdom.
Yes, I 1,000% agree. And I'll even take that a step further is, so the short name of the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford is called the d.school, which is d.school, like, how people say b.school for business school as like for short, like shorthand. So we call ourselves the d.school at Stanford.
See, the dot was throwing me.
Yes,
that's why I didn't want to.
Like, do I say D or do I say duh? You're like, what?
Or D dot.
Yeah,
is it D dot school? And so I'm like, you know what? Why am I gonna walk out on the plank? I'll just send her.
Yeah. So d.school. So the whole mission of the d.school at Stanford, it's a place of innovation. And when we say design, it's not a matter of aesthetics. It's a matter of problem solving. So we're there trying to transform students to have this ability to solve the world's messy problems. And when we do that, like we're in the classroom and, we're putting them through these experiences and, imparting this amazing knowledge. And how do we know if what we're doing is actually working, right? Like we just don't know. And in the past, or typically, it's like self-reported, self-efficacy, like, oh yeah, I think smarter, or yes, I learned a lot. Or we can wait until they go out into the real world and they do something amazing, or they solve this amazing problem. And we're like, look, that's great. Like we did it, or we helped do that. And so what Creative Gym and the backbone of this book. So in Make Possibilities Happen, there's a through line. And it's a creativity study. It's a scientific creativity study that we did at Stanford that proves, like we have fMRI scans that show that people's brains were different after undergoing an abbreviated version of my course, Creative Gym.
I'm telling you, I read this book. Now, the book, if you say read a couple of chapters a day, well, that ain't the way. And those people aren't having you on as a guest of the podcast. So I read it all, and it's a fly-through book. It's brilliant, right? And so I read it in like 2 days. I mean, and that was just in between everything else that I'm doing. As you and I talked, I have a 12 and a 13-year-old, and I loved the practicality of some of the things you talked about. It's one thing to say, be a problem solver. It's another thing to go think outside the box. Does anybody even know what the crud that even means?
I think that's just a saying. And I feel like people misuse it too, because they're like, think outside the box. Well, if you can't define the box, you don't know if you're outside of it. Does that make sense? So you kind of have to learn what the box is, which is what, I think the best analogy for me, because I have older kids than you, they're about to join the workforce in a year or two. And I say, go get a job, go work for somebody else. Then you'll appreciate if you go do your own gig, because doing your own gig is a slog. Like it's an amazing gift, but it's also a choice and it's also a slog in its own right. And how can you appreciate, doing that if you don't even know what, the box is or what having a traditional job is like? Not that jobs are traditional anymore, but
well, no, but you know as well as I do, as far as when it comes up, I'll take my own example because I'm here, but I was a salaried employee my entire career. And then the dynamics changed. And so I became a business owner.
Mhm.
And all the things that I never thought about. And I think I was always a great employee simply because I always understood somebody had to make a decision. Whether I agreed with it or not, somebody had to make a decision. And they had to live with that decision. So I always understood that. But becoming a business owner, you get to see the 19,000 things that go into trying to make a decision.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't get that. I think a lot of and this is not a bash on the younger generation. This is what we're talking about, knowledge and wisdom. They
Yes.
don't have the experience yet. And I think when they get the experience, it changes the dynamic of how they approach their own working life.
Oh, definitely. And just on two things, like you don't know until you know. It's sort of like nobody appreciates their mother until they become a parent. And I mean, obviously a lot of people appreciate their mothers, but you don't truly understand kind of what that responsibility is of being a parent and like the 20,000 decisions a day that you make as
Uh-huh.
a parent until you become a parent and you're responsible for this life, right? That you gave birth to. And so the same thing is, I feel like when you mentioned jobs in the younger generation, and I saw this even in the early 2000s, like when I had a magazine and we had all these young people that were, a decade and a half younger than my partner and I. And it's only increasingly, I want to say, accelerated or has become more amplified is this sense of immediacy and gratification. Like, not that this is a generalization. They want it now, and they're not
Uh-huh.
willing to put in the work that I want to say you and I did,
Yeah.
to kind of like, cut our teeth, earn our chops.
Or they want to start off at a higher level. They don't want to do the slog. They see the people who are at a higher level and they want to ignore, it's like watching Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. Remember that movie? And he became this concert pianist, right? But how he did it was getting up every day and going to a piano lesson because the same day was over and over again. And it took him, somebody did the math on that movie and they said it was probably 200 to 300 years of living that same day over again to become so adept. But nobody wants to see the slog. They want to see him just brilliantly stand up there, and they never knew he played the piano. And now look, he's playing Rhapsody in Blue. They
Yeah.
didn't want to see the effort that went into it. And we've all been, I don't know. I think it was a different generation. And I think I'm a different
No,
generation than
you
you.
and I are in the same generation. So
Yeah, but we knew that you didn't, in my business, you didn't start off at Johnny Carson's level.
no.
You started off doing sports at a small town in Nebraska for $400 a month.
Yeah.
And you knew that was part of the process.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you're dealing with those kids, and these are high level children. And I use the word children simply because I look at them as young, but these are high level motivated kids you're dealing with.
Oh, yeah. And you know what? The beautiful thing is, okay, so there's a counterpoint to what we're talking about, which is before you had to work at that radio station in Arkansas or whatever
Uh-huh.
town that you just mentioned. But now anybody can set up a mic. They can do a podcast. And you know what? That's a beautiful opportunity for the taking. We're talking about possibilities here. We don't have to wait for this radio station to give us the opportunity to broadcast ourselves and be on air and tell our stories or share other people's stories, right? We can do that ourselves. And that is amazing. And I appreciate and applaud that. And on the same side of that coin, you got to put in the hours. I mean, there are very few people who can just show up and be Johnny Carson or be amazing. Most of us have to practice and put in the hours.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Anybody can grab a microphone, but you're not owed an audience.
No,
You
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 earn
have
your audience.
you have to earn it. You have to build it. You have to create it, and I think that's where these shockwaves. But what I love about your book is everything's a problem. I read this morning that the average human, the average adult human, makes up to 1,000 decisions a day, micro decisions.
Yeah.
I'm going to go left. I'm going to have a sip of coffee right now. I'm going to scratch this. And when you start thinking the math of it, right, it's stunning. But it does become routine. What I loved in one of the first exercises, right? Grab something, pick it up, and look and say, what is it? And then what could it be? And it was fascinating.
Isn't that crazy? So just to give the listeners who haven't read the book a little context. So what Gary's talking about is this activity that we call doing a Duchamp. So doing a Duchamp, and the exercise teed up, Duchamp was the most influential artist of the 20th century. He famously took a urinal from a junkyard, turned it upside down, wrote R.S. Mutt, and he put it in art show and he said, "This is art." And the art world was like, "Are you joking? That is a piece of trash." And they were just so angry and so upset. And what Duchamp did was he reframed what that urinal that had a previous purpose and utility, and it no longer had that. So he was giving it a new purpose and utility. And then, so if you're not familiar with Marcel Duchamp, everybody has seen Little Mermaid. That's a famous Disney movie. When Ariel goes down in the ocean, she finds a fork and she's like, "Oh my God, a fork." And she doesn't eat food because she's a mermaid, but she starts combing her hair. And so that fork becomes like a hair comb for her. But that fork could be so many other things. So what we know, our bias, we're biased to what we know. And what we know is based on our context, our experiences, everything that's happened to us to the today. And that keeps us from our possibilities in some ways because we assign meaning to a fork. We're like, "Oh, that's what I eat my breakfast with." But that fork could be so many other things. So we kind of have to let go a little bit of what we know to open our lens to more possibilities.
Yeah, that and another, the other things, all these different things that you had, and these things that anybody can do. Grab a piece of paper and go through and just go through all of these things. And it's, I love the four things, it's see, start, do, finish.
Yeah.
And those are attainable by anyone. And
Anyone.
honestly, in my take on anything.
Yes. No. And you know what? I'm glad you say anything because, there's lots of books out there, life coaches and people who have accomplished billion-dollar, success. And I don't want people to be dissuaded or intimidated by that. Everything we do, each and every one of us has meaning and purpose. So the whole like see, do, start, finish, I do that when I make my dinner. I do that when I plan a trip for my family. I do that when I plan, the 3-year goals for my business. Like to your point, it's large and small and every little bit adds up. And so the whole point of this book is to let people know in your brain. Okay, so this is analogy that I've used, in the last couple of weeks, I think really is easy to grasp. But if I said to you, "Hey, guess what, Gary? I'm going to give you free gas for your whatever vehicles you have for the rest of your life," you're going to be like, "Yeah, like that saves me. That's amazing. Like I have to drive my kid to a soccer game in Livermore, but I have free gas, so I'm not going to worry about that," right? That's like a financial burden that's relieved that is necessary to your existence or the running of your family. Technically, we all have unlimited gas for our brain. If you use if creativity is the gas to our brain, we all have an unlimited supply. And some people are like, "I'm not creative. You're creative. I wasn't born creative." That's total BS. We all have the ability to exercise and build our creative capacity the way we can build our own six pack. You just have to put in the work.
And that's the key out of I was taking this, the see, start, do, finish. It's easy to go with the start as the most important, but I kind of get the feeling, and especially after reading the book, and I was going to ask you, I think do is the most important. What do you think? And I need to tell
Okay, so
everybody, I'm never wrong. I'm never ashamed to be wrong. So
okay,
always
so
go,
I'm not
"Hey,
going to
no, you're wrong."
no, I think action is everything. So you need action to start. So start doesn't exist without doing. So technically you are correct. But
It's
yes,
time.
right.
Yeah.
What I've found over the years is that there are two common pain points standing in between us and the possibilities we want to realize for our lives. And that is starting and finishing. Just like you can't finish anything you don't start. And if you don't do anything, you're not starting. So I think you're right. I think doing might be the crux of everything. We all have great ideas. Ideas are worthless. They're a dime a dozen. We all have 1,000 amazing ideas. But what creates real value is when the rubber meets the road and the person who actually does something about that idea to try to make it happen.
Yeah. Facebook wasn't Zuckerberg's idea. I mean, he just was the one who did it.
Yeah.
And the same thing when you look back on it, Amazon, there was a place that existed there, but Bezos was the one who did it and did it and did it and did it.
Yeah.
Right. And to me, it's like at the risk of sounding heretical, I almost think sometimes vision is a little overrated.
Yeah, it can be. It can be overrated, but I will say in my book, the reason why it precedes start is because your vision is the goal. So if you don't have a destination that you're driving to, then you're kind of driving aimlessly. So that's the seeing part. Seeing is setting the mark of where it is that you want to end up, what it is that you want to realize. And I'm telling you, your brain does not know the difference between a real memory and an imagined memory. I mean, think about athletes, pro athletes, they have a visualization, training as part of their regimen. And they imagine themselves executing the perfect pass or the perfect kick or whatever sport they play. And that creates like a mental muscle memory that helps you bring you closer to the possibility.
And not to denigrate the vision by any stretch of the imagination,
No,
but
I know.
in the case of like you yourself, let's talk paper punk,
Okay.
right? Tell everybody what paper punk is.
Okay. So paper punk, think origami meets Legos. So if you had a bunch of paper blocks that you could build anything with, and these are hollow paper blocks. And the whole concept of that was born actually out of Creative Gym. Nobody really knows this, but there's a dimensional thinking exercise in our building session. And the activity that we give the students is here's a front view and a side view of a 3D object. So like this, draw the object. So if I only showed you this face, and I showed you this face, and out of like 40 students, maybe 25% got it correct. And I was like, oh no, like everybody is on a digital OD diet. Like nobody's living in the real world where they're interacting with their built environment and touching tangible things. They have kind of lost the concept or the skill set of toggling dimension, right? And how are we going to solve the world's messy problems if we're not living in our, tangible world? So I created paper punk. Like, hey, if you're not in my class doing whatever crazy activities or exercise that we're putting people through, you can take paper punk and do it at home. And I'm telling you, again, oh my God, that's an idea. I'm going to make it. It was a bitch to make. It was so hard. And I mean, I'm not going to compare myself to Bezos or Zuckerberg, but it's still this. I'm not going to belittle what I did either, right? Taking an idea from concept to reality. And again, okay, you could do it in a business. Bezos started small too. I mean, he's been around for a long, long time. The shortest overnight success, I think the average is 8 or 10 years. I kid you not. Nothing happens like that. But again, like I want to impart on your listeners that it's everything large and small, and you've got to start somewhere. Something I talk about in the book that's related to this is the ladder principle. So if you visualize a ladder, there's rungs and they're spaced at a certain distance apart so you can put your foot up and not lose your footing as you're ascending up or down the stairs. Imagine if there were uneven gaps or the gaps were too wide. There's no way you would safely be able to use that ladder and get to the roof or get down from the roof. So I think that's a really good visual for people to be like, okay, you're right. I have to be patient and I got to put in the work.
Well, the other thing I love about your story about paper punk is that you came up with some pretty serious production problems, right?
Yeah.
And you had to rethink everything. And in the end, go ahead and tell that story.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. Okay. So what Gary's talking about in the book. So we we manufacture, in fact, this is a paper punk. So this is like something you could build out of paper punk. So each of these are individual blocks, and this is a hollow structure. So this block, our original design was that you would punch out the shape, and you know how those envelopes, you'll just peel the wax on the adhesive, and you don't have to lick the envelope, you just peel and stick. And we thought we would have peel and stick adhesive to enclose the paper block. And we prototyped that when we, told the factory what it was. They're like, oh yeah, we can do that. But then when we actually sent them our files, like, okay, here, can we make a prototype? The factory said, oh no, these are multi-directional adhesive strips. We can't do that. It's only linear. Small detail left out in the beginning. And we're like, holy crap, we spent all this time making this prototype based on this interface. So we had to go back and rethink it. And we ended up doing a notch tab, sort of like, a box, but with a smaller notch. But you know what? That kind of pivot or change or adjustment actually led to the user having both sides of the block. So one side could be maybe this pattern, and maybe the other side is a solid color. And that could be another, again, expanding the user experience because of a manufacturing hurdle that we had. And to your point, we have this vision of where we want to go. Don't hang on to it so tightly, because something might happen along the way that might be here, and it might lead you to something even more incredible than what you would imagine for yourself. Like those little adjustments those are good things. Things that don't work out, that's just your internal compass or the universal compass telling you, yeah, make an adjustment. It's all good. You got to kind of be able to wear that lightly, which is not easy. I'm not going to lie.
Well, my family and friends will tell you, if you know me even a little bit, you know my favorite saying. And my favorite saying is, nothing ever turns out the way you think it will. Good or bad, nothing ever turns out the way you think it will. And yeah, I can go through a long list of pharmaceutical drugs that are out on the market today that were never intended for what they're used for.
Yeah.
And so many different designs that were, hey, we were originally going to do this, and then this happened.
Yeah.
And imagine if people had just said, oh, it failed, so we're done, right?
Yeah, we're done. Okay, so the story I Post-its. This is like who doesn't have this on their desk, right? Like thousands of these. The guy who invented this, it took 10 years. He worked for a huge company, and it didn't, like, the adhesive is very untacky. It got reintroduced 2 or 3 times. Third time was a charm. It finally made it to market, and now it's legend, right? But 10 years. Can you imagine making something? You're like, fine, you took idea to like concept to reality. You're like, this is what it is. It's like, yeah, no. And you're like, what? And then 10 years later, it's like this big, it's like you struck oil, but you're like, that's 10 years old. I mean,
yeah, but now that you're a business owner, or now that you've worked in the world of corporations, you know what my first thought was?
what?
Man, I wouldn't want to be the couple of vice presidents who turned that down.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, because that falls right on you.
Oh my God, that's the CYA. You know what CYA is, right?
Cover your arse.
Yep.
Right?
And I will tell you, that is why personally I love being an entrepreneur. I feel like a lot of decisions that companies make are defensive, right? It's to preserve a certain profitability or to ensure a certain growth. And I'm not saying, even as, us like entrepreneurs, like we don't want profit and we don't want growth. Of course we do.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes those decisions are made kind of in defense and not in a let's try something new. It's more like, nah, I don't know. So just in case it fails, I'm going to say, and
well, it's the whole old Hollywood adage. You can't lose money on movies you don't make.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where it came in from. And so now it's interesting. I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll come right back because I have so much more to talk about, and I can just gab. And I think we're going to end up being best friends, and it's going to be awesome. And she's going to come to my kids' basketball game. It's going to be awesome. Yep. We're going to be right back with Grace Hawthorne. It's time to think differently when it comes to your parties, meetings, and groups. The catering from Havana Cuba restaurant in downtown San Jose. Instead of the same old, how about the most delicious Cuban sandwich you've ever had? You're tired of fries? Plantains, my friends, they'll change your world. And here's something you didn't know. Havana Cuba was voted one of the top 10 tamales in the entire South Bay. They have vegan, vegetarian, and gluten-free options, and their website is 998cuba.com. They're located at 387 South 1st Street in downtown San Jose. It's Havana Cuba. Let's talk relationships. Scary, huh? My friend Stephanie Flood can help. She's offering a video series that'll help you reconnect. You can do it by yourself or together. Shows a kinder and gentler way of interacting with your partner, and that can lead to them responding the same way. And Steph is offering a 100% money-back guarantee if you follow the steps and it doesn't improve the lines of communication. That's not all. Go to afloodoflove.com today, enter the promo code Gary to get a 20% discount off the video series. It's afloodoflove.com. So I find this whole journey so fascinating with Paper Punk. But the main thing, I remember I was talking to a buddy of mine, and I said, I'm going to be talking to this Stanford professor. You know, she's written this book and it's really interesting. And his first thing was, how do you become a professor at Stanford? He goes, it's one thing to be a professor at, say, pick a college you don't know, right? Westmeyer. I mean, just there's a lot of small colleges. But when you get up to the Stanford, Harvard, level, he's like, and I'm like, I'm going to ask her that question.
Okay. So, I can tell you how some people have done it. And just for clarification, because this is super important to the D.school, is I'm an adjunct professor. So I'm an adjunct professor, meaning I'm not a tenured professor at Stanford. I've taught at Stanford for over 15 years, but that is not my primary profession. So they brought me in because I come from industry. So I have like 25 plus years in the entrepreneurial trenches. I have 15 years of teaching in the classroom. And I have 10 years of scientific research, which I did at Stanford with the D.school and the School of Med. So how do you become a professor at Stanford? There was a postdoc on this study, this creativity study, which I'd love to tell you about because how it came about was so amazing. And the team that we had on it was amazing. And I want to say not the most important part. Well, there's two most important parts. One, when you do a project or you pursue something out of pure curiosity, you're not doing it for fame or fortune, or you're doing it because you love it. You're doing it because you're like, I don't know how that works. You're doing it because you're like, I need to find that out. That is the number one amazing thing about why this study exists. The second reason is when you have people who have that work ethic around that same common purpose, then it's like magic. And we had this postdoc. He was a postdoc. So he got his master's. I don't know where he got his master's, but I know he got his PhD at UT Austin. And he was a computer scientist. And he also did, I think, neuroscience. He studied meditation, blah, blah, blah. A postdoc. So you get a PhD. This is like after 7-8 years of college, right? And now you're going to go do research and you're paid very little. And he was the postdoc on this project. And man, he came up with a way with a way for study participants to be able to draw on a tablet in an fMRI scanner, which I don't know if hopefully nobody's been in a scanner, but if you do, it's because you had to have like an X-ray, like a really intricate X-ray, and anything magnetic. You can't have tattoos, you can't have jewelry, you can't have furniture. It's like a magnetic X-ray machine that's very, very detailed. And Manish came up with this amazing way where participants, when you're in those machines, you have to lie still, and the participants can lie still and draw. So he did this amazing study, or we did this task in our amazing study that got published in a highly like a very well-regarded, like when you're an academic, you want to be published in, like the highest academic journal. He did that. And now he is an assistant professor at Stanford. So, I mean, that's just one person's path, right? But how do you do that? I want to say Manish did that because he worked his butt off. He's smart beyond belief. Think about what he studied. He studied, you talked about in the beginning, like, oh, people who do, or people who, theoretical. He kind of has a little bit of all of it. And it just, yeah, it's work ethic and smarts and just ingenuity. I don't know.
Well, and he is the epitome of your C start, do finish, right? I
Yeah,
mean, okay,
yes.
I've got this problem. How do I find, where's my solution? Okay,
Yeah.
here, well, it's going to take a lot of failure. And then when you finally get the failure, okay, now I got to finish it. What does this mean?
Yeah.
We've got
Yeah.
all this data. What does it even mean?
Yes.
And it's, I, I enjoy smart people so much. I
Me too.
really do. I
Me
love, and if you get a chance, I played golf the other day with a guy who was a retired nuclear engineer.
too. Ooh.
Right. And so talking to him about the ins and outs and, are we ever going to get over fear of nuclear energy? And he's like, I think we are. We survived 3 Mile Island. We survived Chernobyl, and those were all man-made. And we survived the ultimate act of God and Fukushima. I mean, we've, and we've done that. Right. And he goes, and it's our only option. He goes, it's the only sustainable
How
thing that we
interesting.
can continue to do. But it's stuff that, here's this radio guy from South Alabama getting a
Right.
chance to talk to this guy and go, wow. And so that's my thing is any advice I have, talk to people, find out their stories. They all have great stories. And especially, I think and that's what I want to ask you, the things you get to learn from the students and their backgrounds and seeing how they think has got to be just not only gratifying, but fascinating.
It's fascinating. I love that you bring up the nuclear scientist or engineer that you played golf with, because it's exactly from that diversity of people's knowledge, context, provenance, expertise. That is where the richness and color of life really comes from. If I had to solve this earth saving problem, I would not put 10 Nobel laureates in a room. I would put a school teacher, a plumber, a contractor, a scientist, a clothing, a fashion designer. I'd put the most diverse group of people with different skills and areas of expertise and knowledge to solve my problem or our problem that would save our lives. It would not smart, it's relative, and it's relative to your point, people's curiosity and how much action do they take on that curiosity, right? Because I mean, that's why it's so fun to talk to people who are smart, because they are curious and they're willing to learn and expand, and they're open, and that's a beautiful thing.
I've had a chance to speak to some really smart people, and one guy told me, he goes, if they ever drop an EMP, right, electromagnetic pulse bomb, he
Uh-huh.
goes, carpenters and plumbers rule the world. You
That's
know,
why I insist on having a landline in my house, even though my husband's like, get rid of that. Why are we paying for that? I'm like, because I want to make sure we can make a phone call. I grew
that's
up
fine
underground.
because you've been enough to see all the different options, right? I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that the beauty thing? I've told this before. When you're a child, you just see A. As you get older, you see A, B. And you get a little older and you're able to go A, B, C, looking ahead.
Yeah.
And I said, hopefully by the end of your life, you hope when you get to be 107 that you can see all the way to Y. Because I don't think anybody ever gets to Z. But, and because you start going, and that's why I think that's what helicopter parents are stuff, right? Because you see the possible outcomes, not
I
what's going to happen.
No, and you know what's so funny is that, and I will only speak for my children who are 18 and 20. My son, they think they know. And I try to think back. I'm like, was I like that? Like when we were young, did you think you knew it all? Or you're like,
Mhm.
my parents, they're dumb. They don't know anything. I know it all. Like they're wrong. Did you think that? I don't remember
I
thinking that.
I thought I was raised in rural Alabama I was the fifth child. I was an oops baby. So my oldest sister is 18 years older than me.
Wow.
And yeah, I've got a nephew who's 2 years younger than me, and he's got 5 grandchildren. Those are my great nieces and nephews, just in case you couldn't tell.
Wow.
But she, and I've said this before. I've said this as I was on a guest on somebody else's podcast the other day. Education was not important. It just wasn't. It wasn't important to their lives. Their parents went through World War One. They lived through World War II. What you did is you worked, you had your children, and you worked at the factory or on the farm, and you died in your 50s. So education was just something that, well, we got to send the kids to school or we're going to get arrested. But at no point was it ever, hey, are you making A's? Are you doing? That was just not a part of my existence. Now, the good Lord blessed me with enough. I think this is important. So I went on my own and went to college. But I always assumed that she maybe wasn't the smartest thing. It wasn't until I got to be 28, 29 years old that I realized I was a fourth grade math teacher trying to teach Einstein higher mathematics.
Yeah.
And because he was, are trying to teach him addition, and he was working so far above the scale, they couldn't realize it. And then I realized, because of my mother's experience and her wisdom, that I realized she was playing 3D chess, and I was still trying to figure out how to get the band off the cards.
So there's a couple things. Okay, so I totally relate to your story because my parents were immigrants. And so for people who immigrate, I mean, both my my dad also he was an engineer, and he was in a PhD program at Cal, and then he got pregnant with my older brother. And so he had to drop out and go get a job. So he couldn't finish that program. But like for my parents, education is the gateway to ensure that I can be gainfully employed for the rest of my life and be able to support myself. That's what it's about, right? And I think about why that's important for them. But to your point, there's information, then there's knowledge, then there's wisdom. And so I actually have an art piece out in the lobby that I made for a TED conference. I think these days when people are surfing the web and they're swiping on Insta and watching YouTube, they think that information is knowledge, and it's not. They think like, oh, I read that, I saw that, I know that. It's like, no, you don't. Like, you have to act on that information to turn it into knowledge. And then from, I want to say, repeated experiences of knowledge is when you kind of distill it to wisdom, right? To that instinct, to that unspeakable, like, I don't have to think about it, I just do it because it's it becomes invisible. So to your point, I think that's something, because we've said that a couple times, right? Information, knowledge. I think these days people think information is knowledge. It's not.
And you see it, and I'm not trying to get controversial, anything on this.
No,
this
I
is just a
know.
conversation, but you see it with people who have a little bit of knowledge and say, well, we should do this because I read it, because I heard somebody say it. Yeah. And it's like, and I have to do this with my children and going, yeah, okay, let's go this all the way through. Let's think the practicality of this out. Let's say, okay, this is what we're doing. If we do this, now this happens. And if this happens, now this happens. And we all need that. Hey, gee, boy, we all need to appeal to the better part of our natures. You know what I mean? But by the same token, we need to go, but what's the other side of this? And I say this, it's purely as observation. Oregon went and decriminalized most drugs, thinking, well, if we just make drugs not illegal, then people won't have to steal to get them. Well, this week they just introduced legislation to try to recriminalize all the drugs.
Oh, wow.
Because nothing ever turns out the way you think you will. And again, it's the knowledge, it's the experience. Now they have the wisdom.
Data, right.
They had the information. They threw the knowledge in there. And now with the information and the knowledge, now they have the wisdom to go, okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, and you know what? The whole idea isn't to like villainize or be like, oh, you're dumb because you have this opinion. I think what's important is for people to widen their lens. We talk about possibility, right? And when you say appeal to I call it the greater good, Like, right? Like we're all in it together, people. Like we are all here. You're born and then you die, and everything in between is what can you do, right? Like what are you going to do with your time and your life that's going to be meaningful, that's going to leave something behind that's good, right? Like what is that? And I think if we all like approach life with that lens, I think we'll all maybe feel a little more comfortable and not hang on to things so tightly. It's not
Yeah.
about right or wrong. I mean, when I say that, I don't mean that like, yeah, there's some ethical things that are right or wrong, but I mean like, you're right, I'm wrong. It's like, there's no
Yeah.
win with that. There just isn't.
And if you don't take the time to listen to what people do, and I've found that before, and I tell that to my sons, listen, my views are my views. They're not your views. But I will tell you that I created my views because I tried to study every issue. That's all I will ever ask of you. Do the work, do the information. And then if you come to a completely different conclusion than me, we're good.
Yeah.
We're 100% good because I'm not here. I'm here to raise you. I'm here to, teach you how to do things. And hopefully I try to do like one of the things my mother said. I was years ago, I was 8 or 9 and I was complaining about something. And she goes, "You don't understand my job." And I'm like, "What?"
She
And
said that?
she goes, "My job is to teach you how to raise my grandchildren. And I know you're not hearing anything I'm saying right now, but years from now, son, you will cling to every word." And the reason I can tell you that story is because it was so imprinted on me. I can remember her. I can remember the sun over her shoulder. I can remember the dress she was wearing, because at that point, my brain said, this right here. This is what you need to know.
Yeah.
And so I try to tell that to my kids. I'm
love
just
that.
trying to
I
teach
love
you
that
how to
memory
do
and
it.
that visual. I love it.
Yeah, it's like, I'm just trying to teach you because you're going to, I've got boys, but I'm like, I tell my son, your 16-year-old daughter is going to come up to you and go, "Well, Dad," and I want you to be able to go, "How'd the old man handle this? Let me think about this for a second."
Yeah. And you know what? Don't like, as a parent, like my son's like, "Oh, you're nagging me. Stop it. Be quiet." I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do what I need to do so I have no regrets on my intentions with you. It's my job to be in your ear. It's my job to do this. And one day you'll figure it out. And, like, I don't know if it's a girl thing, and I'm not going to put a gender thing, but I think you just
I've got 4 sisters. Don't forget that.
Well, you gave a hat tip to your mom. It's like, again, you're not going to appreciate your mom the way she needs to be appreciated until you become a parent. Facts. I don't know. Anybody can argue all they want, but when you become a parent, you're like, oh,
Well, and you start to
okay.
time travel. What I've always tell everybody is you time travel, because when you become a parent, you can go back and maybe understand. You don't have to agree with what your parents did,
No.
but you can understand some of the decisions they make. And when you look at your child, you can go, "Okay, hold on here." As I said, I talk to my son about their imaginary children all the time. At some point, you're going to
doing that.
yeah, because you're going to have to, and this is what that's going to go. And I'll give you one more story. When you talked about our kids always roll their eyes, I was talking to this country singer one time, a big star.
Oh.
And I said, and he had some teenage kids, and I was like, "How's it going? Do they know who you are?" He goes, "Dude, I took them to the movie the other day, them and their friends." And I go, and there's only like it was 1:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday or something. And he goes, "There's nobody there." So we sit down in this row, and I go grab popcorn and Cokes and stuff. I come back and they have moved 12 rows away from me.
What?
And because, they wanted to be cool. And he goes, I literally screamed at them, "Get back here. Don't you realize I'm the coolest person in this room right now?"
That's hilarious. He had to like throw his weight.
Yeah. And he said, Tim McGraw one time told me, he goes, "The only time my kids, they're much because they're older now." He goes, "About the only weight that I have to pull is when there's a concert ticket they want to see if I can get them."
Oh, yeah.
Not for his concert.
Right. Of course.
Can you get me Justin Timberlake tickets? Can you get me Taylor Swift tickets? That's when he becomes Tim McGraw. So even though you founded a company and you're an adjunct professor, yet your 18 and 20-year-old will get there and they'll go, wow, Mom, how did you do this? And it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, when that day comes, I'm calling you and saying, hey, guess what? It happened. I told my son, I'm like, oh my God, I get paid to speak to people. I'm talking to you for free. Like, you should listen to what I'm saying. And he could give two beeps about it. Literally.
I
He
was
could
an
care less.
I was an English lit major, right? And I've talked my entire life. And this happened literally last night. My sixth grader had to write a quatrain. In case you don't know what a quatrain, it's a 4-line poem, and it's usually funny and light, right? And he's like, and I'm like, he goes, and I said, well, you want me to help you? And he goes, yeah. And so I just, taking the subject of what he was working on, started throwing out some rhyming, lighthearted lines. And he proceeded to tell me why I was wrong over and over again. And I finally said, okay, you're getting angry at somebody who is trying to help you. You're getting angry at somebody who has studied this longer than you were alive. And you're
Yeah.
getting angry at somebody who literally talks for a living, who, just like you, there would people who would pay me to do this for them.
Yeah.
And you are telling me you're wrong.
Yeah.
And luckily my wife was folding laundry and she looked at him and she goes, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so
One day they'll learn. The one day they'll learn. And maybe
the
it's
thing,
payback from us not knowing. And that maybe that's just what life is, right? That realization. I don't know.
and they'll get there. It's the same
Well,
thing. I've told you when we first started, when you first came on, before we started, I'm like, I went for my run because I'm trying my best to stay alive. The reason I want to stay alive, I have one goal. I want to see them have their children. And when
yeah.
they hold their child, I want to point at him and go, hey, that's you and me. You got that, right? That's you and me.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how I felt when I held you. I
Yeah.
get
Oh,
it.
I love that. I love that.
And I have this the thing I was telling my wife one time, talking about her parents, because my parents have passed, about, grandchildren and stuff. And, the whole story, if I know grandkids were this much fun, I would have just went straight to grandkids. And I'm like, I think that's a misnomer. You know why I think grandkids are popular? Because as a parent, you love your child so much. And when you see them love something that much, you cannot help but to love it twice as much yourself.
Yeah. I never thought of it that way.
So
Yeah.
one day I'll write a book. No, I won't. I have
Yeah.
I will not see. Okay, I'll see. I will not start. I will not do, and I will not finish.
Now, if you verbalize that, if you reframe that and verbalize that in a positive, assumptive way, Gary, you actually might end up with a book this year.
Well,
You never know.
All right, Grace, you're up at
I
Stanford.
love your stories. I love like 18, the youngest with the 18-year gap, 18-year gap. I mean,
It was like being raised by 4 mothers.
I'm telling you, life is stranger than fiction. And those are the stories that are the fabric of our humanity.
I'm getting Matthew McConaughey to play me in the movie. I don't care what anybody says.
Oh, he's so good.
Like I look anything. No, but I don't care what anybody says. That's what I'm holding out for.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love his voice. I think
so. You're at Stanford. I'm going to say this one day. And one day I'm going to bug you to let me go watch you work in class, because I think that would be the most delightful thing ever that I could see.
Yeah.
I think watching that would be such a hoot. So
I would love that. Feel free. The course happens once a year. So let's keep in touch. I'd love to have you drop in anytime.
I'm going to do that. I write columns on Substack, and I'm going to come home that day and I'm going to write, because I can't wait for it. The book, again, Make Possibilities Happen, How to Transform Ideals into Reality. And I knew this was going to be so much fun. I don't know why. Just reading that book, I'm like, she talks like how I would, you write like how I would talk if I talked that well.
So you're a tiger dad? Because I'm a tiger mom. No, I'm kidding.
I'm more like a kangaroo dad. Your mother's pouch is right over there.
That sounds, I want it. Kangaroo dad. That sounds like a fun dad.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing about and I kid them like, you don't want me involved in this, right? You don't want me involved. When they're trying to have an argument or something with their mother, and I'm like, you don't want me involved.
You gotta back your wife. That's all I
Well,
gotta say.
they know, and I've said this to my kids, and I told this to my son. I said, "Don't ever put me in a position of choosing between you and her, because I need to tell you to your face, I will choose her 100% of the time,
Mm-hmm.
100%. And I love you so much that I would give up my life for you today,
Yeah.
but I'll always choose her." So just so we're clear.
Just so you know the ground rules here.
Well, and you're trying to teach them, right? When they have their children too. When you've got that 16-year-old daughter, don't put me. She's my girl. She's my partner. She's my life. That's it. That's where we're going.
Model the behavior you want your children to have when they get old. Like okay, that's not why I call my mother all the time, but I want them to see me call my mother all the time. So when they are out of my house and they have their own family, they're going to be calling me all the time.
And they will. They absolutely will. Grace Hawthorne, you're the best.